Well, welcome to the panel, Preserving the Promise of Cancer Immunotherapy. My name is Louise Perkins, and I'm the Chief Science Officer at the Melanoma Research Alliance, or MRA. I want to just give you a quick orientation to our organization and the state of affairs in melanoma, because what's gone on in melanoma is very much a case study for what is happening in cancer research overall with respect to immunotherapy. So a quick word about MRA. We're the largest nonprofit funder of melanoma research, having invested over $100 million in the research since our founding in 2007 by Deborah and Leon Black. We were founded under the auspices of the Milken Institute, and our mission is to eliminate melanoma suffering and death. Now, not everyone knows what melanoma is, but it is the deadliest of the skin cancers. And this year alone, there will be 91,000 people in the US diagnosed with this disease and over 9,000 deaths. It's hard to think about these numbers, but to put it in perspective, one person dies every hour of melanoma in this country. One way to prevent that is by early detection, and to amplify the message around early detection, we have undertaken a Skin Check Pledge campaign. If I could have slide 6, please. We're doing this in concert with L'Oréal Paris, and the Skin Check Pledge campaign is designed so that everyone who signs up for the Skin Check will lead to $100 being committed to MRA research by L'Oréal Paris, up to a maximum of $250,000. And you can find that on our website at curemelanoma.org. That's curemelanoma.org, which is what we're doing. Seems like we're not.
It's up.
It's up. Oh, there it is. Yay. And you can do it on your iPhone. It's super, super easy. It's 4 fields. Go for it. And the skin checks are good for you to prevent melanoma and other cancers. But for those whose melanoma is not caught early, there's been incredible progress since 2011 with 11 new treatments approved. And those include not only immunotherapy drugs, but also targeted therapy drugs. We will be focusing on immunotherapy, in particular checkpoint immunotherapy drugs, because these have really been game changers in the field. And the first of those checkpoint immunotherapies were approved to treat melanoma, and now are being used to treat 7 additional cancers. But immunotherapy goes beyond just these checkpoint inhibitors. It includes things like cytokines like interferon, it includes interleukin, it includes oncolytic viral therapy, it includes CAR T therapies, such as those advanced by Novartis and Gilead. So what you can know by hearing all of those names about approaches to treatment is that there has been an explosion of interest and an explosion of investment in this area. We can take the slide down, thank you. There's been just a huge amount of investment in this area, mergers and acquisitions. There are great dollars at stake, but most importantly, patient lives are at stake. In order to get any of these things moved to market, clinical trials have to happen. And in order to get to those clinical trials, research has to happen. So it seems like we're in a golden age of immuno-oncology, and the question is, what must be undertaken so that this doesn't go off the rails, so that the innovation can continue to happen? And that's the subject for the conversation we'll be having today. We have assembled a tremendous group of experts for you to address these questions, to discuss lessons learned, to describe different collaborative models, and talk about how to advance more and better of these breakthrough therapies. So I'd like to introduce you briefly to the panelists with us. You have more complete information on them in your program. Pablo Legorreta is founder and CEO of Royalty Pharma. He also serves on the boards of a number of health-related nonprofits. Johanna Mercier is president and head of US Commercial at Bristol-Myers Squibb, and also served as BMS president of Worldwide Markets for Europe, Australia, and Canada. Jill O'Donnell-Tormé is CEO and Director of Scientific Affairs at the Nonprofit Cancer Research Institute, or CRI, where she's been leading the efforts of that program to make cancer immunotherapy a reality for quite some time. Antoni Ribas is Professor of Medicine at the University of California at Los Angeles and Director of the Tumor Immunology Program at the Johnson Comprehensive Cancer Center. He's a world leader in laboratory research on melanoma and melanoma clinical research and treatment. And finally, Greg Simon is president of the Biden Cancer Initiative. He was executive director of the White House Cancer Moonshot Task Force and has had a career in both the for-profit and non-profit healthcare sectors. So to get us started today, I'd actually like to turn to you, Tony. As someone who sees patients in the clinic, clearly the ultimate stakeholder in all of this, would you just orient the audience to the impact of immunotherapy and how your conversations are going with these people today as compared to some time ago?
Sure. Obviously, we now have an array of new treatments. When I started treating melanoma 15 years ago, I could probably treat, on advanced disease, I could treat maybe 1 in 20 patients where we had low activity agents that occasionally would give benefit. The few that had long-term benefit, we thought we incriminated the immune response. And people like Jill, who had been funding immunotherapy, had been studying, putting money into studying those few cases. Now, at least a third of my patients, and getting closer to half of my patients, are living a normal life despite having a metastatic disease, a cancer that has spread through the blood, gone to any organ. I have patients with brain metastases going on for 10 years. I have patients with lung, liver metastases going on for longer than that. And it's not an anecdote anymore. Now it's the norm, but also tells us we have to do a lot more because the other half are not doing well. And we've gotten here based on applying science into patients. What the federal government and foundations have invested on basic science for the last 30 years, basic science in fruit flies and in worms, are now translating into better understanding human disease and industry developing drugs that are highly effective. So I hope we continue on this path.
Great. Thank you, Tony. So clearly there's been a lot of progress, and I've heard some of the oncologists talk about sending their patients to survivor clinics, which they didn't do before.
Yeah, I have patients who ask me, should I get the life insurance? What a problem.
That's a great problem to have. And Jill, you've really been at the forefront of driving cancer immunotherapy with CRI. Tell us a little bit about how we've gotten where we are and your thoughts on how to keep the momentum going.
Certainly. So the Cancer Research Institute, for those of you who do not know us, we've been around for 65 years, always focused on the field of cancer immunology. So way before this last decade of great excitement. And I think this single-minded perseverance has paid off because we basically believe to take the long road and funding the very fundamental basic science first. First, understanding how the immune system works before it could be intelligently applied to the cancer question. And I think it all comes back to that. And I think we've been lucky after having been around. I've been more than 3 decades at the Cancer Research Institute, so I've seen the ups and downs of the field where it was really overhyped prematurely, crashed and burned. Everybody believed it was tested and eliminate cancer immunotherapy. It doesn't work. And I think what you would say is that those prior history was because we really didn't understand the biology or the mechanisms. And luckily enough, we are now at a stage that we understand it a little bit more. And we've been very lucky, especially first in melanoma, that these checkpoint blockades, basically just taking the brakes off your immune system. So much in the past had been focused on activating your immune system to recognize and destroy cancer. We know that the immune system has this innate ability, but it really became only known probably in the last 15 to 20 years that besides activation, your body has a normal way of shutting your immune system off so you don't develop autoimmunity. And cancer cells have co-opted that pathway as a protective mechanism against an immune response. And it's really these checkpoint blockades, these so-called monoclonal antibodies that block that checkpoint that usually turns off your immune system that allows this immune response to continue and work. And believe it or not, it's what has turned the field around. First in melanoma, and I think more that really turned the field around was when we started seeing these checkpoint blockades work in things like non-small cell lung cancer, a disease that was never considered to be immunotherapy amenable at all, and a major health problem. And we're seeing, people that are living multiple years and having durable responses. And so I think we're at a place that we've never been before. We now have proof of principle that the immune system in the right person, when you activate it and control immunosuppression properly in that patient, you can get these remarkable, sustainable, and durable responses. But we're only very much at the beginning. And we really have to understand that 50 to 70% of the patients that aren't responding. Why? But we're now at a place where we can ask questions that we never could before. Technologies are allowing us to do this. We have a pool of responders and a pool of non-responders. So interrogating these precious patient samples from patients that have responded or non-responded to understand what is the deficit in the immune cycle in these patients that don't just respond to a single checkpoint blockade. And this is where we are right now, and it's a great excitement for the field because unlike targeted therapies where you talk about it's one single pathway, you can kind of a switch on and off, The immune system is a very complex, multifaceted being almost, and that you can come in it at a lot of different areas, and we have to understand what it will take, what combinations we need to bring, whether they're IO combinations or combinations with standard therapies like chemotherapy and radiation, need to work in that patient. And that's where we are now, and I think with continued research, and we will get there.
That's great. Yeah, it really has been a game changer. And just to sort of step back, I mean, most of you know what chemotherapy is. And now, maybe you knew much about immunotherapy before you walked in the room. And if you had to pick between chemotherapy and immunotherapy, who here would pick chemotherapy, right? The idea of harnessing your own immune system to learn how to fight off the tumor, or to be, maybe it already learned, but to be able to step in and do the job it was trained to do. That's where we are today with these off-the-shelf drugs, these checkpoint immunotherapies. BMS has actually been at the forefront of moving these ahead to the market with several key approvals, including ipilimumab and nivolumab, Yervoy and Opdivo as they're known by brand. Tell us a little bit about what the conversation at BMS is like today, Johanna, and with these marquee drugs in the pipeline and thinking about the next level of innovation.
Yeah, thanks, Louise. I think it's exactly what Jill was saying. We're just at the beginning of the journey, and there's so much more to do. There's still 50% of those patients that aren't responding, and we need to try to understand why. And so looking at validated pathways is what we've been doing, so not just CTLA-4 pathway, PD-1 pathway, but also looking at IL-2 pathway. And those are the 3 validated pathways right now in immuno-oncology. And so looking at combinations, looking at what that looks like, and of course that increases the number of clinical trials out not only in the US but across the world, which has other issues, of course. I would say one of the issues with immuno-oncology is resistance. We've never been in a world where actually in first line we are using immuno-oncology, but what we're seeing is second line resistance is happening, and so how do we get ahead of the game there? Because that's going to be the next issue on the table. So a lot of that work's going on. I will tell you the challenge is funding all of that work. And so the collaboration, the reason why we have this panel today is critical, because the funding and the research doesn't just come from industry. It comes from academia, it comes from community, it comes from advocacy policy, it comes from different investor groups, all of that, pulling it together. And the last piece I just wanted to say is, and Jill, you kind of touched on this, is that cancer biology. The cancer biology is different for every tumor. There's over 100 different tumors, but it's also different for every single patient. It is unique to that patient. And there is such an opportunity to better understand the gene sequencing of every single one of those patients diagnosed with cancer. And the more we can share that data, that collaboration piece of the data, the science, the expertise, I think we can move faster. So as much as we're at the beginning of the journey, there's an opportunity for us to speed up that journey to really get towards the possibility of a cure.
And there's so much more data to be collected and produced, because what happens in a tumor is one thing, what happens in your body is another, but the interplay between your tumor and your body's immune system, that is complex over time, it's complex three-dimensionally, and we've actually funded research engaging astrophysicists to work with pathologists to understand what are some of the changes that take place when individuals are on treatment. So there's going to be tons and tons of data to be produced and analyzed, and lots of room for further understanding to be produced. But Pablo, we've been singing the praises of where we are right now and some of the prospects ahead of us, talked about the limitations. But from a business perspective, give us a little of a reality check, and is it a gold rush? Is it a golden age? What part of gold are we living through?
So I'd like to start by picking up on the initial comment you made where you said it's the golden age of melanoma, golden age of immuno-oncology. And I think a very important reflection for all of us here is that the way I see it, and many people that have been following this field for decades see it, is that it's really the golden age of biotech. So from a societal perspective and investor perspective, scientists, companies, I think there's a very important reflection that we need to make about allocation of resources. And I think the excitement that we're seeing here is correct. The advances in overall survival, responses survival for patients has been dramatic. So there's no question that we should all be very excited. But I think an important reflection is the amount of resources that have been allocated to this field. And there's a slide too, if I can please have it, that just illustrates what's going on in this field. And you will see that there's something like, there's currently today 5 drugs that are approved, antibodies that are being used to treat this kind of cancers. There's 45 that are in human clinical trials and another 116 in preclinical testing. We have never, ever seen this kind of focus, this kind of resources in life sciences. And just to contrast this, for example, if you look at autoimmune diseases, which are vast, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's, psoriasis, after 20 years of the introduction of the biologics in autoimmune diseases, we have about a dozen, maybe 20 if you add other kinds of approaches, drugs that have been developed to treat these diseases. And in immuno-oncology, as you can see, the field has gotten crowded. So I think there's today, from a societal perspective, important questions that need to be asked. We don't need 20, 30 similar drugs to be brought to market and tested on patients. Why? Because a lot of it can become me too, and it's not okay for patients. And you know, from investors' perspective, I think we need to ask very important questions about you know, how to do this in a smart way, designing the right trials, not funding me too compounds, and then also trying to understand what are the priorities. And I think a point was made about taking these advances from the current patients that are benefit beyond those patients. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in combination trials and therapies that will cost a lot of money. And I think we need to figure out how to do it in a way where we're smart about the employment of all of this human capital and financial capital.
Great, thank you. And Jill, you want to comment on this, because I know these data come from a study that your group produced. Yeah, so the Cancer Research Institute undertook, and we are still ongoing, a landscape review of the immunotherapy space, mostly self-serving originally, because for our clinical investments that we want to do in clinical trials, we didn't want to replicate what pharma or biotech were already doing with philanthropic dollars. So we were looking for white spaces. But we became to understand that this is valuable data that the entire field should see. There's over 3,000 immunotherapy clinical trials ongoing right now. Half of them are with PD-1 or PD-L1. This is telling you that there's great innovation, there's great excitement, but of course I think, as Pablo said, that we have to look at effectiveness and efficiencies here. Of those 1,500 trials, over 60% of them are single-site academic investigator-initiated trials. And I think this is a place, academia is where discovery comes from, but I think from being self-serving at the Cancer Research Institute, we would like to see as a not-for-profit that we can bring these academics together using platform trials that would actually be more efficient ways that we can take small cohorts of patients with ideas that are coming out of academia, doing de-risking for pharma and seeing big signals and then really giving informed decisions to pharma. What do they take on to their development pathway? And I think this is our strategy with our clinical accelerator at CRI. We're partnering with organizations like the Parker Institute. We've also have another collaborations with the Canadian Clinical Trials Group that we're able to deliver multi-center trials at pharma level quality so that pharma can take the results from this in. And I think it's a great de-risking as an incubator. It's an academic industry incubator. It's venture philanthropy funded, and we get a return on investment if pharma takes this into their pipeline. So I think it's a great model as a way that we need to understand this. How can we make the process more efficient in this time of great innovation?
So thank you. Let's unpack a couple of the things that were in there. You talked about new philanthropic models to support the research. You talked about the interface between academic research and company research. And Pablo, coming back to you, also, you know, what do we do with all of these potentially Me Too drugs that are being moved through development? And Johanna, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot right now. Why would anyone want to be developing the 45th PD-1 drug? What's in it for them? What are they thinking? And I know you're in the catbird seat as BMS, but what are they thinking?
Well, I can tell you from a BMS perspective, I don't know what they're thinking. No, I'm just kidding. I think a lot of it has to do with they all understand where the market is going, and they also understand that its combination therapy is going to be key. It's actually easier if you own a PD-1 to actually do those combinations, because from a return on investment, it's just much faster. So I think there's probably a piece of that puzzle. I also think that anybody not part of the game that missed a little bit the angle is trying to jump in the game a little bit late stage. So there's a little bit of that going on as well. I think competition is healthy. I think in any environment, I think it's critical. What I would say though, and you look at the number of trials that Jill and Pablo were talking about, I like the idea of bringing it all together from an academic standpoint, because a lot of these are investigator-sponsored trials, not just pharma trials, obviously. And so bringing all that together, which goes back to the whole collaboration theme that we need to pull together a little bit better. And collaboration even across industry. So I'm not just talking across industry, academia, community, et cetera. I really am thinking also industry. I think when a trial fails or doesn't meet its primary endpoint, we actually learn more of those failings than we do with a positive trial. And digging into that data is absolutely critical. But to say that all those agents have a space, maybe not. But I think if that's how we advance the science, to think about those different combination therapies, as we think about the different tumors as well, as we think about the future, the resistance piece that we touched on earlier, I think all of those pieces together, the more players in the game, the more maybe we'll get there faster.
So Greg, saved maybe the best for last in the initial round of discussion. We've talked about collaboration, data sharing, communication. I mean, you make good progress on that through the White House Cancer Moonshot program, driving collaboration. Tell us a little bit about some of those successes and what you view as some of the holdups in making the promise of cancer immunotherapy a reality.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I've been involved with biotech since 1985, and I think the overarching principle is the triumph of hope over experience. And I say that because nobody thinks that their drug is the 45th drug. But it is. And but the reason you ask why do they do it, their board demands that they do it, because they have to have a player on the field. So the question becomes, here we have this wonderful science, and I've met several people who've gotten out of their deathbeds and are now healthy, in most cases young people who had stage 4 cancer in their 20s or 30s. And the question is, why are we approaching immunotherapy so much in the same way, the same modality that we approach small molecule clinical trials and development? If we went back to 85 and told me someday you're going to be able to zoom into a picture using your fingers to pinch on your touch screen on your smartphone in 1985, when I didn't even have a pager, I would think you were crazy. But if you had told me, you know what, 30 years from now we're going to be curing people by using the immune system, but the only thing that's not going to change is how we go about doing that. The research system in 85 is the research system we have today. Nothing else is the same. So if you listen to the success stories, we're dealing with handfuls of people. Nobody has enough big data in their own institution to understand truly all the failures, because they don't have enough of them. So that means that there's no such thing as one company or one university or one institution being able to parse why the responders and the non-responders differ without looking at the data from everybody else doing it. But that's not the system we have. So what that means is, as Pablo referred to, we're going to waste a lot of patients in control arms of the over 1,200 combination trials because we refuse to collaborate on existing standard control arm data that could be used by all of these trials, because it's the same standard treatment. In many of the cases that we've been using for years, we have tons of data, but we still keep putting patients on those drugs for the control arm. We don't know what the side effects are. A lot of people are getting type 1 diabetes from their cancer treatment. Now, they'll trade diabetes for cancer any day. They don't need to worry about life insurance because they're not going to be able to get any. That's another story. I'm a CLL leukemia survivor. When I tried to get insurance through our nonprofit, they wrote me a letter that just said, ha, 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 ha. But that's okay. So the challenge I really think is we're going to spend a fortune on helping a relatively small number of people unless we use all of the data from everybody working together to understand how to make this work for large numbers of people. But that's not the process, which is why the Biden Cancer Initiative is so focused on doing that. Now, when we were in the White House and we did the Cancer Moonshot, you know, the VA shared its massive medical record collection with the Department of Energy, which has the world's fastest computers. And it's such a huge project, they actually had to build a dedicated data network for $4 million between the VA and DOE. The NCI is creating a drug formulary, so if you want to do a combination trial with drugs from different industry partners, it would take you years to negotiate those one at a time. Instead, the formulary is everything's worked out in advance. You show up, you sign on, you use the licensing agreement, IP agreement, et cetera. We started using a program at the VA to have every cancer patient sequenced and have these mutation reviewed by Watson's library function to see what's already out in the literature, which no one doctor can even keep up with. So there's so many, and one last thing, we need to understand the immune system a whole lot better. And one thing we want to understand is what is a predictor for cancer that we might be able to start the immune system working a little sooner than when you have stage 4 cancer. And everybody wants to be able to do liquid biopsies, blood profiling prediction. I get 2 emails a week that people have figured this out. They haven't. So we started a consortium called the Blood Profiling Atlas Consortium, which is now privately independent of anybody. It's their own self-funded, self-directed thing, to bring partners from industry, from the government, FDA is part of it, universities, to try to figure out what's real in the prediction quality of your blood. It's very, very difficult, but the end game could be quite impactful. So all of those programs started in the Moonshot, they're still going on, and what we're trying to do now at the Biden Cancer Initiative is really connect all the data we have, just think of it as an immunotherapy information repository. That doesn't exist. It has to exist if we're going to make progress in this field. And one last point, we still design clinical trials that do things to patients, but not a lot of doing with patients, and sometimes not even for patients. We need to, and the Biden Cancer Initiative is focused on this, start designing trials with the patients early in the process, make the trials available to them where they are, instead of them having to commute hundreds of miles every other week, when the protocol can be trained to people in their community. And we need to also not forget pediatric trials, which are often shorted because if there's not an adult indication, people drop it, when often the pediatric drug might be available even when the adult indication doesn't work, because the cancer mechanism in children and adults is a very different thing.
So maybe just to add to a couple of the points, Greg, you just made, I think one of the pieces is around translational medicine that you touched on, and it's such an important piece of the puzzle. And a lot of the times we've been leveraging translational medicine from discovery to development, which is obviously to get those drugs into development. Where we haven't been doing such a great job is actually from development to the patient. And I think there's a real nice opportunity for all of us to kind of pull that data together. The sharing the data is a real challenge. That is one that, and when I'm talking about data, I'm talking about big data and all the way to the gene sequencing standpoint. And I think that's one of the pieces where we've tried to do different collaborations and bring different groups together, but I think there's definitely more work to be done. And the last piece of the puzzle around the patient engagement, it's interesting, we've just started. So I'll preface that over the last 2 years or so, really bringing patients into the clinical trial design and actually asking them, patients that have the same disease that we're studying, and actually asking them kind of what works for them, what doesn't work for them, and working very closely with the communities, because if you think about it, 80% of the patient population in the US get treated in the community, not in academia. And so how do you make sure that you leverage that community center? How do you make sure you leverage the community oncologists that see maybe 1, 2 renal patients a year, maybe 5 lung cancer patients a year? So to really understand and bring that to life. So patient-reported outcomes, for example, those kind of things, bringing it to the table. You probably all know clinicaltrial.gov is a great site, just very complicated to navigate, and to say the least. And so one of the things we've done is at Bristol-Myers Squibb, but I think most of industry has tried to pull this together, and I think CRI as well, is to try to pull together websites for patients to know where to go. And so we have a website called Study Connect, but it's connected patients to the studies, and to make sure that they understand where the sites are, which physicians are the ones that can help them. But more importantly, if there's not a study or a site for them that BMS is funding, what are the other product sites that might be interesting for them, and then connect them back to clinicaltrial.gov. So trying to connect the patient to really what's going on is absolutely critical, but there's definitely a lot more work to be done. And again, partnering with CRI as we do, partnering with some different foundations, I think has moved the needle a little bit on that one.
I think it's great. Patients will enter into these conversations about their care, their clinical trial, if they're even thinking about it. They have questions about clinical trials. I think there's a lot of information that they'll come upon in different ways. So it's fabulous that different groups, and ourselves included, the academic centers, have those kinds of entry points. Tony, the one challenging problem is this getting access to patients sufficient to do all of the clinical trials that could potentially be done if all of the combinations were tested, all the investigator-initiated studies are done. I know you asked the question, kind of a rhetorical question at a meeting we had a while ago about, are there too many clinical trials? I think you and I may have disagreed on that, but tell us how those trials can be enrolled.
And the disagreement was that I said there's not too many clinical trials. If something works, we'll know it, and it's going to be by testing in humans. The preclinical testing in whatever system is only tell us what we should take to patients. When we take it into patients, if it works or not, that's the real goal. Why did PD-1 work better than CTLA-4? Well, if you look at all the preclinical data, CTLA-4 blockade should work better than PD-1 blockade. One in humans is the other way around, because T cells that are attacking the tumor are turned off by PD-L1 that the tumor makes to turn off the immune response. Take that out, and you get a significant number of patients to respond. Significant, but the minority. So there has to be something that's limiting those same T cells at earlier stages. And that's where the combinations come. The science for most of these, 1,000 clinical trials and combinations is all really solid. You can look at every one of those agents that are in the BMS portfolio, the Merck portfolio, the Novartis portfolio, or the small biotech that's biting on just one target. And you look at how many papers support that that's a good idea to take to patients, it's amazing. So the science is there. It matters if it works in patients. I don't think we have too many clinical trials. I do think, as Jill was saying, that we should be more efficient on doing them. Jill talked about a platform trial. That means you take an indication. I treat melanoma. My biggest unmet medical need is patients who progress on PD-1 therapies. I can open a clinical trial. It takes me 2 years to open a clinical trial, talking with the company, doing the regulatory work, the budget and everything. We do the clinical trial for a year, and we enter, 20, 30 patients. And if that combination didn't work, there's no next step. But instead of doing this, we had a study where we take an indication and we start having doublets of therapies that make sense to be combining. And I think now we have to do triplets if we're thinking about 3 to 5 years from now. And then we will be more efficient in trying to see which one works. And we don't need a control arm. We know that that's a situation where there's an unmet medical need. Nothing that we know works in that situation. So if something starts accumulating responders, we'll put more patients onto that. If we don't do that. Maybe something that may tie into the binding initiative and the moonshot, and it's been discussed in that setting. But it's something that will require bringing together portfolios from different companies, putting them together in an efficient way, opening the studies in enough places so we could accrue these patients.
I mean, there's clearly been a lot more collaboration and set up across industry and with industry and academia. But as you say, Tony, there's a lot of good reasons to do the trials that are ongoing right now. I still feel as though, and the disagreement is, I feel as though there could be some smarter selection of priorities for trials. But there is a lack of the preclinical data to differentiate things, and as Tony rightly points out, those models are not always 100% predictive. Quite often they're not 100% predictive.
But I would say that I think going that way, they are predictive, but I think what we have to do is reverse translation now. Because we now have these pools of patients that respond and not respond. At the unmet need, resistance to PD-1. Well, you need to look at those patient samples now as where you do the correlative research. That's where you do your translational research to give you the hint of how do you prioritize the thousands of, probably more, combinations that are potentially possible. I mean, we can't do it all, and it all comes down to understanding the biology of that resistance that can give you the hint of what is the best combinations to prioritize going forward. I think that's where we are, and that's what we need to do.
We're not that good at predicting this. I think we're better at looking back.
Yeah.
If a patient responds, I'll go to clinic this afternoon. If I have a patient who comes today and responded to a therapy, it's not by chance. That patient is not lucky, even though we say, oh, we're lucky, you responded. Luck doesn't exist. It's a biological process that led to a certain situation, that led to a drug doing something beneficial to that patient. If we have enough data points, we would be able to detect that. We actually don't. So whenever to select patients would mean that we already knew the biology and already knew what's going to happen, and then we select the right patients. Right now we're in the setting of we have responders, non-responders. We study them. We sequence everything that we can. In my lab, we just get a tissue and sequence the hell out of everything because that's the right thing to do to understand why would somebody respond or not. And with that, then we make a hypothesis that we're going to test prospectively. But with the new drugs that are making it to the clinic, we cannot do that because until we have enough information, do they do well? First, do we have the right dose? Is it safe? Do we have an effect? Is this effect in a certain indication? And then we can start studying. So I think it's the reverse translation. It's something that always goes behind the first clinical testing.
And so we have a lack of information on a number of fronts scientifically, but as an investor, Pablo, what are you viewing as the sweet spot? How do you diagnose the right investment to make?
We have been looking at the whole space and are very interested in actually getting involved. And at Royalty Pharma, we have actually started to ourselves fund clinical trials and working with some of the big companies. In the case of Pfizer, we funded a breast cancer trial for an approved drug, actually 2 trials that are looking at the potential label expansion of that drug, Ibrance, into pre-metastatic disease. And we're doing that with other companies. I think the important thing to consider here is there are already a lot of really good compounds in immuno-oncology that are out there. And obviously companies like Bristol-Myers and others are at the lead. The question becomes, and you were asking the question before, what decisions do you make to fund things? So in companies, are easier to get funding from VCs if they have an exciting drug like a PD-1. They can go public if they have an exciting drug like a PD-1. But the reality is that for the ones that are way behind, it doesn't make much sense to actually get in the game at this point. And I think, maybe disagreeing a little bit with Tony, who's focusing on melanoma, I think we have to think beyond melanoma and many other tumor types. And realize that at the end of the day, what's happening, don't get me wrong, it's going to be fantastic for patients because there will be alternatives. But the question is, are people going to make money? Is investors, venture capitalists, which are critical for this whole process because all of the things that are coming out of academia initially get funded by VCs. And then obviously they go to biotechs, which end up getting funded by the markets. And if at the end this does not result in a good return for these investors, there's going to be a pullback. And I think also thinking beyond oncology, there's so many different therapeutic classes that today still require huge investment. Alzheimer's, for example, and many other diseases. And what's a shame and to see is how, for example, the industry has withdrawn from many of those areas. And they've actually moved into immuno-oncology, great. There's huge advances. But I think, you know, at least from my perspective, we have to be just careful and realize that we have to be a little bit more thoughtful the way we go ahead. And one of the things that I think, you know, thinking about the key opinion leaders like you, Tony, and others, is if there can be some thought, and also the disease-specific foundations, about whether it makes sense to fund the 45th immuno-oncology, and just push back and say we already have, you know, many of them in clinical trials. We don't need another one. What we need is smarter trials, figuring out how we get the responses beyond the 50%, what combinations make sense. Anyway, so that's my perspective.
Yeah, I think being able to go beyond just do it yourself and you get something approved versus learning something from the collaboration, from the data that's being produced, from having some rationale behind why you want to push the 45th. Maybe you have the magic combination, maybe you don't. And Greg, and just on that idea of collaboration, you also raised the subject of side effects to immunotherapy, and we haven't talked about those because these are not drugs that are as safe as water, and in order to try to understand that, MRA went into a collaboration with the American Cancer Society to fund research in this area. We'll hopefully be announcing those grants very soon, but that's just, you know, a drop in a very large barrel of understanding that needs to be created to understand and potentially mitigate some of the side effects. But isn't there information that could be learned from what those side effects are to understand what's going on in other diseases, rheumatological diseases, diabetes, that we could harness from some of that data sharing? Is that something that you think we could take further as a field?
Yes. Any work on the immune system is valuable for everything to do with the immune system. As Tony mentioned, what you're really doing with immunotherapy in cancer is you're creating a targeted autoimmune response. And the question is, how do you target it and keep it targeted? This is not fun. I mean, people who go through these trials, the immune system wreaks havoc on your digestive system, on your nervous. I mean, it is not a good experience. And we need to understand how we tune up, so to speak, the immune response. But the industry, this is not new. For the whole time I've been involved with the industry, it's as if they can only deal with one big idea at a time. And the big idea used to be combinatorial chemistry. You remember that? And then it moved to this. Well, we still don't understand metastasis enough to prevent it. We still don't understand how to contain cancer rather than try to destroy it. And the reason I bring it up is study after study and experience after experience shows that the more aggressive you treat many cancers, the worse they get. This is especially true in glioblastoma. The more you treat it, the worse it gets. Why? Because the treatments are trying to destroy the cancer cells, and those cancer cells have friends in your healthy cells as well. They communicate with them, and they say, we're all under attack because it's a systemic treatment. And when your body feels it's completely under attack, it responds in an evolutionary way for survival. And the cancer has far more ways to survive than we have to kill it. So we need to start moving away from killing it to containing it. If you could keep a skin cancer from breaking through the sheath under your epidermis to become melanoma that spreads like a tree system in its roots, you would do an amazing job of turning melanoma away from being terminal. That's not how we approach it right now. So they're not just the side effects, but we're going to keep using chemotherapy and radiation. We need to understand how they can boost the immune system. So the American Association of Cancer Researchers Conference 2 weeks ago in Chicago, there was a huge announcement about the better treatment of lung cancer with immunotherapy in combination with chemotherapy. And it was much better than immunotherapy alone or chemotherapy alone. The question is, in what order do you do these things and to what degree? We need to know more about radiation as a stimulus for the immune system. We all think of radiation as something you go in to kill things. If you give a generalized dose of radiation to a cancer patient before the immunotherapy, it gives a boost to the immune system because it's under a gentle attack, not a deadly attack, but it raises its level of activity, which means when the immunotherapy comes in, it gets even a bigger boost. So there are all kinds of questions, but we tend to focus on the big one, and later we're going to figure out how to deal with all these other things. One last point about how patients navigate through all this. Not to be the idiot in the room, I chose chemotherapy over a yet uncompletely approved immunotherapy drug. It was only approved for patients who had failed other treatments for my CLL, my leukemia. And my doctor said, we can find a way to get you on this drug if you really want to do it. It's not approved for first-line treatment. It's for a mutation you don't have, and you're going to take it the rest of your life. But if you did the chemo, it's going to be 6 months and done, which is exactly what happened. Now, if I get a relapse, they probably would not give me chemotherapy because that drug is now approved for frontline therapy. And if you relapse, you probably do want to take something the rest of your life. But the patients have to make these choices. So at the Biden Cancer Initiative, one of the things we're doing is putting together our patient roadmap so that patients know what they need to know and they know where to find it from a trusted source. And we're giving awards for the best content in different areas. And we're also crowdsourcing the interface so that we have the most intuitive, usable interface for patients to figure out where to get financial help. What is immunotherapy? How do I decide whether I want immunotherapy? How do I tell my kids I have cancer? How do I tell my mother I have cancer? The things that patients deal with that nobody in the doctor's office talks to them about because they can't get that into the 20 minutes. So there's a lot going on here.
Great, thanks, Greg. I want to take just a few minutes to have questions from the audience and then come back to the panel for a lightning round. So please use the microphone. I see a hand raised in the back, and we'll pass the microphone along.
Thanks. Great panel. One of you made an allusion to the use of big data for this whole process, but unless I missed it, we didn't really focus on it. It seems to me a lot of the larger firms are focused on using big data, alternative data, personal data right now to accelerate research in this field. Could each of you talk about kind of your knowledge, what your view is, your vantage point on this subject matter? Is it being embraced yet by the larger community? Any thoughts there I think would be interesting.
I think we'll let one person answer just in the interest of time, and I don't know, Greg or Tony.
Yeah, or Jill. So the data we're talking about, just to be clear, you have clinical trial data, which is standardized if it's going to the FDA, and so it's much easier to analyze and share that. You have medical records, which are a Tower of Babel, which is really hard to do any work with. You have genomic sequencing, which also has standard approaches, but is too expensive for insurance companies to pay for everybody to have it. So it's something that doesn't easily come to patients to pay for, and the insurance industry is still of several minds about how valuable it's going to be. And then you have outcomes data. Did any of this work? And if it did, why? And if it didn't, why not? As I mentioned earlier, no institution has enough data to be really big data to a computer scientist. Looks like a lot of data, but when you parse it, it's non-comparable data, it's non-reliable data, it's non-standardized data. So what we've got now are a number of companies that are working to navigate this maze to turn the medical records into common language that you can compare Epic and Cerner and Allscripts and everybody else, genome sequencing at below market rates to create the database with the people whose medical records you just cleaned up, and outcomes from what happened in their treatment. Tempus is the biggest company I know doing this in Chicago, started by Eric Lakofsky, who started Groupon. And it's a highly intensive manual process, hundreds of millions of dollars and hundreds of people. This is not what the rest of the world does with data, but we do it in medical. Genome sequencing is going to get virtually free, but we still don't know how valuable it is. We still don't know how valuable it is because we still don't understand the genome. That's understandable. It's hard. As the president would say, who knew how complicated the genome can be? Tony did, I'm sure. And then finally, we have to, the problem we haven't talked about, but which I just want to plant in your mind is that lung cancer breakthrough I mentioned a minute ago, it might take 10 years for that therapy to be used by doctors all over the country, because doctors are notoriously resistant to new therapies, new drugs, new medications. They tend to prescribe their whole career what they studied in med school. So even if we have a breakthrough at Sloan Kettering and UCSF and UCLA, getting it in Memphis or Bemidji, Minnesota, or Little Rock, Arkansas, might be a decade away. That's unacceptable. That is unacceptable.
I'm afraid I have to cut off the questions because we need to wrap up in just a few minutes. So, but the panel will be available for questions immediately afterwards. So thank you for your interest and your questions. I really do appreciate it. In the last minutes we have remaining to us, I wanted to challenge you each as panelists to offer your insights and wisdom in a minute and a half. I'm not sure which is the bigger challenge, the time or the question. The question really is, in your opinion, what would be the most important single step that could be taken to ensure that immuno-oncology innovation continues? Pablo, I'm looking at you.
Get organized. All of us that are in this panel, and maybe more you than I, can influence how this is going to be done. By having more collaboration between the key opinion leaders and the Melanoma Research Alliance, all of the foundations that are working, and trying to actually figure out how to do this in a way that's going to be more efficient and better for everybody, for the patients, for investors, for the doctors that are treating, and getting the right answers. But I think it's a question of collaboration, getting people to work together on this.
All right, great. Johanna.
So maybe building on the theme collaboration, I agree. I would just take it one step further. I think that from a data standpoint, we need to be sharing more. And I think if you go back 10, 15 years ago, and there was all these campaigns about know your numbers for cholesterol, for hypertension, et cetera, my vision for the future is know your genes, know your gene sequencing, understand the biology of the tumor. And the more we can pull that data together to understand the science, and then we follow that science, because patients are still waiting for us.
Great, thank you. Jill.
Well, I'm going to say we need sustained sources of funding for research, and not to forget the basic research. It's basic research where all the discoveries come from. And though we're in the clinical space right now, without that continued source of funding from the federal government or from other not-for-profit agencies, we are not going to continue to innovate. So I think it's really important to understand the length it takes, the time it takes, but the necessity of funding really good people doing really good science.
What we saw in the slide that Pablo shared, I think it's exciting. I hope we continue to invest on it. It's going to be cheap for society on long term. I read the book about penicillin. At the beginning, you had to purify somebody's urine to get penicillin to somebody else because it was too expensive to make penicillin. We're in that situation with immuno-oncology. But in the future, we're going to use these combinations, 2 or 3 drugs to treat the majority of patients, and we'll do it effectively. We don't want to wait 30, 40 years for that. We want to do it as soon as possible. We don't want more people dying if we can prevent it. So everything we have discussed is about understanding more, investing more, knowing more, making it more efficient too, but not putting a brake on these. There's not too much. It's just we need to make it a little bit more rational.
Greg?
So I think every valuable movement requires a central organizing principle. So Facebook, the central organizing principle was he wanted to meet women. Sean Parker and Napster, he liked music and didn't want to keep paying the man for having, he didn't want to buy an album, he just wanted a song. Mike Milken, human capital is the most valuable asset of any organization. What's the organizing principle in immunotherapy that would cover all these issues that we've talked about today? There isn't one. The organizing principle should be, I humbly suggest, that patients should be at the center of every decision we make about how to progress in immunotherapy. And if people really did that, then they would say to themselves, if patients are at the center of what we're doing, then we need to share our data with everybody else so that we can understand patients as a group, not just our patients. Then we need to standardize the way we're doing the science. We need to standardize the way we're doing the trial protocols so we can spread them around, and you don't have to be in New York to get in one. There's so many aspects of this that if you decided each thing without an organizing principle, it's chaos. So if you just put patients at the center, it dictates the answer for every other hard problem you have. And it sounds simple, but it's not that simple. As Johanna said a moment ago, for 2 years now, BMS has been working more with patients. In Faster Cures in 2004, we put out a paper on clinical trials that begged the industry, please use patients to design the trials, not just be in the trials. It takes a long time for these ideas to sink in and happen, and now they're happening. That's great. But we need to really go all the way and put patients at the center.
Thanks. That's a great wrap-up. So you are here hearing these experts talk about this sea change in the way cancer is being treated. There is potentially the opportunity for a further sea change in how the research is done, how collaboration is done, how incentives are used to drive further innovation in this really important area, taking advantage of existing treatment options like radiation therapy and chemotherapy and targeted therapy, but not losing sight of the patients, as Greg just outlined, to recognize that we are in the long game to try to find cures for many different kinds of cancer patients, but those patients don't have the time for the long game to happen. Tony's treating the patient in front of him every day. So there's clearly a push-pull, but it's a really exciting time to witness. I hope none of you ever have to experience this firsthand as patients or as the loved one of a patient, but if you do, know that the world has changed. It's changed for the better because of individuals like this driving the field, and there is so much more to come. So please join me in thanking my panelists for today's discussion.